Hello everyone and welcome back to some tutorial gameplay of Wargame Airland Battle. I guess this would be like episode 2 of our little series here. It's kind of a big head start for beginners series, how to take beginners and get them to play well, and so that's what we're trying to do here. Today we're going to talk a lot about going through your deck and how do you choose units. So we're going to talk a lot about um, the different stats and really we're just going to talk about the different kind of units because there's just a ton of different units and they all work differently. So understanding what are the different kind of units and how they all work, and eventually as you go along and you'll have to play well, you'll start being able to attach all the different names to the different units. But really there's maybe 15 different unit types that you need to understand. And so that's what we'll do today. And then after that, I think we're going to work on some missile play using rocket launcher artillery in a game. That should be a lot of fun. But before all that, I wanted to go back and look at what we did in our last episode, I guess, and just kind of talk the strategy about what went right and what went wrong. And so here's just our little YouTube video. And I'd say, we won about 1,000 points for our team. We killed something like 2,000 and lost maybe 1,000. And so that's admirable. We helped our team win. But we're definitely aiming more for, we want to kill 3,000 for every 1,000 that we lose. If you're seeing numbers like that, you're getting where you need to be. And so there's definitely some good things and some bad things, I would say, in this game. Our opening worked well. I think that's one thing you have to have a gambit. You have to have your opening move, and you have to consider what their opening moves are going to be. And in our case, it all worked out pretty well for us. They opened up with a couple of Tomcats, which we'll talk about that later, but they're radar jets. They shoot radar missiles, which means they can shoot anti-air, which was kind of effective because they actually shot down a lot of our infantry units right at the beginning, or just flying in the helicopters. But we were prepared for that. We played it safe. We covered all of our different angles, and so we brought in our Strelas, and they were effective at fighting off the anti-air. And so by that point, they came in with all these different APCs, so this is probably just the other teammate who came in with all the APCs and all these infantry. But he didn't bring any anti-air, and so that was just a huge mistake on his part. There's just no reason not to. I guess they figured they brought in the Tomcats and that would be enough, but it really wasn't. And so you definitely need more anti-air than that. And basically, I came in with these 2 helicopters and just annihilated everything he had. And eventually, these helicopters will get shot down, but just when you don't have your anti-air there, you open yourself up to a lot of really bad openings. And they very quickly lost complete control of this zone. And because of the way the hills are on this zone, if you lose it, it's super hard to get it back. And so that was just a big mistake on their part. And so I'd say our opening worked out really well. I watched this and went through a couple of notes. I think a big thing that we looked at in this game was anti-air. Some of the big mistakes we made later on is we didn't separate our anti-air enough. You always got to separate your units. Things like anything that's lightly armored or unarmored, you got to keep separated because there's just between artillery, bombs, and just all sorts of different things. It's just way too easy to get them killed off. And so I know at one point they came with the Nighthawk and blew up all of our anti-air just in one shot, and so that was just our fault for not splitting them. Also, always remember to, when you have your Tunguskas, if you're playing packed, always remember to turn off those guns. The radar guns, because every time you leave your radar guns on, you're opening yourself up to just anti-radar missiles or anti-air planes. And so we actually lost a couple of anti-air Tunguskas just because we forgot to turn that off. And then I'd say later on, our big mistake here, we figured, we just had so much success at the beginning, we figured we could do whatever we wanted, and we came in and to flank this other side. And what happens, just the way geography works, anytime you're flanking the enemy, you're actually opening up your own flank. So if we're flanking over here, we're actually opening up our flank up top. And so we just assumed, I don't know, we just figured we're so far ahead that they probably just won't be ready for us, and we could just flank these guys super fast, and that wasn't the case at all. Basically, every time we tried to move in, we just got caught by everything up here, and it worked out okay. We intercepted a lot of their own reinforcements, but every time we turned to fight them, we just get pulled closer and closer to this city and this tree line. And that was really just the bane of everything we were doing. We just kept getting pulled into the city and the tree line and just kept getting killed. I kept thinking if I got close enough to this tree line, I'd be able to see the people in them, and that never happened. Not until it was too late, at least. And so it just kind of goes to show you how effective trees can be. And so using your tree lines and putting tanks in here or infantry or anything can just be really effective as far as just like keeping the enemy from being able to push. And so, but I'd say there was definitely some things to improve on, some good and there's definitely some bad. But that's a good little, I guess, some little treatise on that. Okay, now to start looking at the units and how do we build a deck, or basically how do we choose units, and really I think we're just going to go over the different unit types because there's just so many different units that work so differently. So if we come down here, we hit into our deck, and down if we hit this army button, it'll let us see all of the possible units in the game. For what we're going to do for our purposes, we're going to focus just on the USA units and the Soviet units. Because one thing to know is if you play ranked games, you'll actually play USA versus USA, or you'll play NATO. NATO versus NATO, or you'll play Pact versus Pact to avoid balancing issues. But when you play regular games just for fun, you'll play NATO versus Pact. And so if we're going to go over kind of these different units, because if you're not playing one, if you're new, you're probably playing the other one against the other one. And so we'll kind of go over we'll focus mostly on the USA units just because the names are easier to understand. But we can identify kind of the Soviet units too. But we're going to start off with the most difficult and kind of go backwards. We're going to start with planes. Planes are just really complicated, and we're going to try not to get lost in going over this. But there's the game is going to separate the planes into probably 3 different types, and these are all these different icons. You've got bombers here. You can see right here these icons. This is what you're going to see on the map. You got bombers. These 2 arrows means it's multi-purpose. It means they'll do a couple of different things. And right here, that little icon means anti-radar, and we'll talk about exactly how those work. And then air superiority, which means they shoot down other planes. But there's actually quite a few, it's kind of subcategories to all of those. So that's what we're going to start with. And so actually this is a good place to start. Let's look at the Tomcat. And these are called, these are radar, we can call them radar planes. Basically what they do is they shoot radar missiles. You see here, it'll say that rad, well here just radar missiles. What makes radar missiles so unique and useful is that they just have insane range, and so you see 11,000 or almost 12,000 range on airplanes. That's huge. Basically, you can sit this guy in one zone, and he'll usually shoot the zone next to him. And so he's just really effective anti-air because of that distance. And what you can do with these is you can use them anywhere on the map. And so if you even see all the way across the map that your your ally is being attacked by planes, you can just send this guy in. And in a lot of cases, if you see the planes coming, you can intercept them with Tomcats before they even get to their target, just because the range is so long. One thing to notice, a lot of times people will say you really need to get at least 2 Tomcats, because one, it shoots these missiles, but it's at a fairly low rate of fire. It takes like 4 seconds in between every missile that it fires. And just one of these, they're decent missiles, but they're not like insanely effective, especially the distance that you're shooting from. And so typically 1 missile is enough. It takes usually at least 2 to shoot down a plane. And so when you have 2 of them flying together, they both shoot, and you typically will shoot down the plane, and then they'll reload, and then 4 seconds later they'll shoot down another plane. If you only have 1, it shoots, it misses, it waits for a while, it shoots another. It's just really slow, and it's not nearly as effective as having 2 put together. But that's kind of our first type of plane you need to understand, are these radar missile shooting planes. As far as I know, I think you can only get these radar planes in either the USA or the Soviets. But yeah, the Soviets have one, and all the different names of the Soviets are all MiG whatevers. So you're just going to have to look through it, and maybe we'll look at it when we go through our own deck, you'll see them, but I'll identify the names here in the US first. So first we start off with those radar. Let's go next, we look at anti-radar. If you remember we played that last game, they kept using these anti-radar planes, and we could never shoot them down. And that's what these are. They're these weasels. The way that anti-radar jets work is they have these anti-radar missiles. They also have really pretty long range, and so this one's not even as long. I know the Raven is an option that actually has even longer range. And here, yeah, it's almost 5,000 range. And one thing to know is that these are fire and forget. So with that F and F, whenever you see that, it means fire and forget. Fire and forget just means that you don't even have to aim the things. As long as you're within range of a target, it'll automatically lock on, it'll shoot, and then you can leave, you can do anything you want. You don't have to continue to guide the missile at all. Whereas if you have different missiles or jets that require some sort of guidance, your jet typically has to get I mean, it typically has to aim at it and it has to approach it, and the longer that you're approaching an enemy target, that's usually the longer you're getting closer to other anti-air. And so that's one thing about these anti-radar jets, is that they don't have to dive into their target. They just stay at high altitude. And a big part of being shot down by missiles has to do with distance. And so if you're all the way up, you're not nearly as close as you would be if you would dive down to a target. And so that's why a lot of times these anti-radar jets can get away, and that's why we can never shoot down those weasels. It's just the fact that they are so high up, they don't have to dive down; they just fly overhead, and then they're gone. And so, but that's the next type you need to understand, anti-radar. And so those they're just good. They can only target things that are radar, that use radar, so mostly anti-air. They don't work on, they only target ground, as you can see. So you can't use these to shoot down Tomcats, even though those are radar missiles. These will only target ground, so you can only use them for radar anti-air, and that's really what they're good for. But if your players are smart, they're not going to use a whole lot of radar anti-air. But if you do see that someone's taking advantage of radar anti-air, these can be really effective to take those out. And they also just do really good at flying cover. If you send them in before your other jets, since they don't dive in or get too close, typically everyone shoots at them, and they usually don't get hit, and they can be an initial buffer for the rest of your jets. Let's look at the air superiority fighters. And Tomcat is a type of air superiority, but there are just regular jets. They'll just use regular infrared. There's quite a few here, but the way that these will work, they'll just use infrared. Another kind of one thing to note when people use these anti-radar missiles are called SEED. I don't even know what that stands for, to be honest. But yes, if you hear someone talking about SEED, that's what they're talking about, is anti-radar missiles. And then we want to talk about trying to find some semi-active missiles. The way that semi-active missiles work is they actually have to be guided the entire way to their targets. That's right here, this SA right here, semi-active missiles. And so a lot of times you'll see these on the air superiority fighters. Semi-active missiles, basically your jet's going to have to find its target, and it's going to have to chase it down until the missile hits. Which can be bad, because it means that you really have to get close to your target, and you have to be able to trail it. But a lot of times these semi-active they tend to be more accurate. They tend to be pretty effective once they do lock on. The hard part of using these kind of air superiority fighters is that a lot of times it's just hard to get close enough to the enemy jets, because they don't stick around. The bombers come in and then they leave. So unless your jet's already there waiting, by the time you see him coming and by the time you call this jet in, he's usually too late to get close enough to start using his semi-active missiles. And so that's why Tomcats can be pretty useful. But obviously the best solution is just to use your own anti-air and just have it on the ground already. Don't rely too much on jets. But Tomcats are kind of a useful fail-safe, and then these can be really effective if you time it right. And so, but they're fun to use if you're into that. But they can be a little difficult to get the timing right. And then we gotta go to bombers. Basically, you have napalm bombers. This is, as far as NATO goes, since they don't have the Bernardino, I think it's called, that napalm rocket launcher that we used in the last game. The closest thing they have is just using these Corsairs. And basically these Corsairs, and there's a couple other options as well, but they drop napalm bombs. And so you fly in a whole bunch of these Corsairs, and they can just drop a whole bunch of bombs, napalm on a city. And so usually you'll have to buy quite a few of these, like 3 or 4, and then you'll bomb the entire city all at once. But you have napalm, and then we have cluster bombs. And so Skyhawks are HE kind of cluster kind of bombs, and these actually, I guess these aren't officially even cluster bombs. An example of cluster bombs would probably be, let's see, where are they? Aardvarks are cluster bombs. So aardvarks, when you have your bombers, you have HE bombers, which are for either unarmored or light armored targets. So they're good at killing infantry, they're good at killing jeeps, they're good at killing artillery. But then armor piercing, which is in case these aardvarks are armor piercing, are good at killing tanks. And so you see that the power is not great. And so just one of these bombs isn't enough, and that's why. But you're actually dropping, this one's dropping 12 at a time. This one's going to drop 8 at a time. And so typically one of these isn't enough. Like if you see an elite tank, one of these, one bombing run of an aardvark usually is enough. But sending in 2 at a time is pretty effective. This is really effective if they have like cheap, like they have that T-55 kind of rush where they have all those little cheap tanks. These can be really effective because they'll drop their bombs in a line, and so if you orient your jet before dropping, and so you can use shift click and queue up, so you can send him off to the right and then shift click in so that he'll come in at the angle that you want and then drop your bombs. You can drop a whole line, and sometimes you can take out a whole line of tanks, but it'll usually take one or two aardvarks to pull that off. But yeah, so you can have cluster bombs for either for anti-tank, which is your AP, or for anti-infantry or unarmored. A unique thing that NATO has that PAC doesn't is this Nighthawk. The Nighthawk is not perfect. It's a major disadvantage. It has no ECM, and so now let's start talking about the different stats here and how you're choosing your units and why one unit is better than the other. The big thing about jets is all about ECM. It's electronic countermeasures, and basically this is what the game rolls against to find out if a missile is going to hit you. And so what decides if a missile is going to hit you? A is the accuracy of the missile. Different anti-air have different accuracies. B is the distance, and so that's why we talk about one huge advantage about this Nighthawk, the way it works, is that it flies super high, and since it has these fire and forget missiles, and he flies at super high altitude, and there's no stat on here that tells you what altitude a plane flies at, but just from experience I can tell you that the Nighthawk is probably the highest, and it's very unique in that sense. He flies very high, he drops his missile very early, and since it's fire and forget and there's only one of them, it doesn't take him long to aim it, he just drops it, he doesn't get very close to his target, and then he instantly evacs out. And so for that reason, he never gets close, and he never dives to his target, he never gets too close, and so he never gets too close to the anti-air around the target either. And that kind of works to his advantage, because the farther away you are when the rocket launches, or and I don't know if whether it's when the rocket launches or when it hits, I mean, I don't really know, you just assume it's when it launches. It makes it that much less likely for the missile to hit you. And so distance is definitely a big deal. And so that's the disadvantage of planes that have to dive in very close to drop their bombs, is that they get so close and they're much more likely to get shot down. Whereas the Black Hawk keeps its distance. And so whereas it doesn't have any ECM, it has the advantage of staying high, and so it pretty much is, I'd say it's about equal to what most of the other jets, like the high ECM jets, it has about the same likelihood of being shot down as any of the other jets, as far as I can tell. It works very effective if like you have a target that's out in front away from the anti-air, because what he does have, so he doesn't have ECM, but he has stealth, and stealth is what decides how close you have to be before something can see you. And so since he has exceptional stealth, a lot of times they don't see him until he's right in range, and so if you have an anti-air that's kind of far away, I mean, you'll see him, he'll drop his bomb, and the missiles will launch maybe one shot at him, and then he'll disappear. And so he's pretty effective if you can hit targets that are out in front versus targets that are behind, because if the target's behind a bunch of anti-air, it's got to fly through all the anti-air to get to it, and he'll get shot down real easy. But this is a very unique plane, and his bomb, you see here, if you look at HE power, it tells you how powerful the bomb is. And the bigger this number is, A is how much it does more damage. It also means the AoE that it has gets bigger. And so you can drop one of these paveway bombs, and it'll take out an entire section of a city. It'll take out an entire section of a forest. And so just kind of like just a huge little cluster. I mean, it's really just fun to use. And so I recommend using Nighthawks just for fun. They're just pretty cool. So that's all I have to say about that. So I mean, let's see. Yeah, so we're talking about exactly what are the units you need to look at. You need to look at how many. So I mean, if this bomb is still, I mean, the bombs it's dropping only have 4 accuracy and 4 AP power, which is pretty low. But if there's 12 of them, I mean, that's quite a bit more. So you definitely need to look at how many it's dropping, and the rate of fire. And so, for instance, if we look at a Raven, we're shooting 20 rounds a minute versus a Tomcat is only shooting 15 rounds a minute. And so I mean that's definitely important to look at. You'll notice that some of these are fire and forget missiles, whereas other ones are guided. That's definitely important to know. But yeah, definitely make sure you understand whether your bombs are HE or whether they're armor piercing. Always take a look at your rate of fire. And yeah, the biggest thing about your jets is the ECM. I mean, that's if you have exceptional ECM. To give you a ballpark figure, I mean, I would say if you have 0 ECM, it takes about 2 average missiles to shoot you down. Whereas if you have exceptional, it takes oh, I don't know, 4 or 6. I mean, it can be quite a bit more. And then the next thing you look at speed. The faster he's going, the less time he spends over, enemy territory. Stealth is, I mean, in the case of jets, it's not super important. So I mean, it's not super big deal. And so, but in the only case here in the Nighthawk, you have exceptional stealth, which is just the only reason that you might want this is like if let's say they're shooting artillery at you. They've got like all those Malkas in the back, and they're just shooting artillery at you. I mean, it's definitely possible to actually sneak your Nighthawk all the way around the map, and then you won't. I mean, the planes can't see the ground, so you have to um, force like attack position. But like if you see the artillery shooting from a position, you can actually sneak your Nighthawk around the back and then force attack a specific spot, and it'll drop a bomb there and blow up an entire line of artillery if they don't have anti-air there to stop you. And so that's an interesting way you could try and use Nighthawks. But those are the big things: ECM, speed, and then a lot of it. See, it doesn't tell you here, but you'll have to experiment a little bit. A lot of it comes down to basically how close the jet has to get get its bombs off. But I think this is a good start on understanding how the planes work. So make sure you understand you have anti-radar planes, and when you see those icons, you understand you need to turn off all of your radar anti-air because that's what they're going to shoot down. You have your Tomcat, which are just these radar missile launching jets, and so if you see those, understand that they have insane range. They can shoot down from very far away. And there's just quite a few different kinds of bombers to learn about. But that should be good enough to get started. So now we look at our helicopters, different kind of weapons we have. We have these kind of like these, I don't know, I guess they shoot rockets here. These don't have a lot of ammunition typically, so typically he uses all of these. He shoots all of these rockets off at these kind of helicopters, and then he runs out pretty quick. But the rockets are super widespread, and the real purpose of these, they can kill infantry if they're like, I mean, it can be pretty good for shooting a line of infantry. But the biggest advantage of these rockets that you'll see, and you can get these on planes, but they're not as effective, but that you'll see on a lot of helicopters, is that they will stun and panic enemy tanks, and so it helps to I mean, so just kind of as support, it comes in, it'll stun the tank, and when they get stunned and panicked, their accuracy goes way down and their effectiveness. A lot of times they won't even respond when the enemy commander tries to tell them what to do. And so that's what these are really for. They're definitely useful against any sort of unarmored or very lightly armored vehicles, so APCs, things like that. Is what these missiles are good for. But if you really want to shoot a jet and kill a jet, these won't do it. These do not kill anything that's armored. They just don't do it. And so what you need is something that has a TOW missile or some sort of rocket, like a missile launcher. I mean, so if you look at these, we see here the accuracy 12 and our AP is 22. So basically this number 22 tells you it can do probably a maximum of about 22 damage. And to give you an idea, I mean, you could pretty much say that it's just typically take out an elite tank in one shot if it's a perfect hit. But if not, it won't be quite perfect. And so that's really like these TOW missiles where they're really useful is shooting down elite tanks because they're just so much damage they do if they hit you. And so when someone's shooting a missile at you, again, it comes down to range. It comes down to the accuracy. And then also a huge part of it has to do with the veterancy of the unit. As it gains veterancy, its accuracy goes way up, and so it's definitely something to know. And so in some cases, using a unit like choosing to get less of the, or getting like a unit that's not necessarily, or like a vehicle type that's not as good. If you get it at a high veterancy, that some cases that'll be more accurate than using something that's naturally more accurate. And so it is pretty significant how much the veterancy will affect both your rate of fire and your accuracy. So that's something to take into account as well. But yeah, typically your Cobras here are kind of your anti-ground. This Super Cobra has infrared missiles, and so these are good. These are anti-air missiles, and so really useful for shooting down other helicopters. I mean, that's probably the biggest usefulness, and they will shoot back at airplanes. And so, but the big thing you want to look at is rate of fire on these. And so, when anything that shoots a missile, I mean, so this is shooting 30 rounds a minute. That's pretty good. And so will these, but there'll be a lot of things that only shoot at 15 rounds a minute. So you definitely need to check what is the rate of fire that these things are shooting at when you're picking out your units. As far as helicopters go, I mean, here's some unique helicopters here for NATO that they only have Stingers on them. They're pretty low range, but they're definitely good for shooting down either other helicopters, and they can shoot back airplanes that come in close. But they only have 5 HE, it's not super powerful, but they have 11 accuracy. That's what you want to look at when you're looking at your helicopters. You're definitely going to look at what weapons are on it, because that's really what's important about these helicopters, is whether they have these little rocket canisters, or just going to shoot a bunch of rockets, which are useful for killing infantry, whether they have a TOW or some sort of missile rocket on it to be able to shoot anti-tanks. You see the AP power here. And you're definitely going to look at the accuracy and the rate of fire on these. That's a big deal. And whether they have infrared missiles in order to shoot down either other helicopters or to shoot down planes. And so that's probably pretty good to understand helicopters, how they work. So here vehicles. Vehicles is basically anything that is either unarmored or light armored. And so there's actually quite a few different kinds you can use. Some of these, let's see, some of these are kind of just like APCs, and but a lot of times you're going to look for one that has a rocket launcher on it. And so here we see this only shoots 10 rounds per minute, and so this is not as good as, like, for instance, the helicopter we looked at a little bit. But we'll notice that the range is a big deal. 2625 is probably the maximum range for a NATO, and 2800 meters is probably the maximum range on a Soviet rocket launcher or kind of TOW missile launcher. And so I mean, that's definitely a big deal, getting as much range as you can. And then accuracy is a huge deal. I mean, it's just so annoying to watch missiles miss and miss. I mean, they look cool, but if they're missing all the time, they're just not really working for you. But it's nothing. So you notice here, if I come back here, this M150, it'll go at 30 rounds a minute, versus this guy's only shooting at 10 rounds a minute. And so you definitely have to make a choice here. Which one's more effective? And so in this case, this M150 is actually cheaper. It doesn't have as much armor, but it actually just does a whole lot more damage. And so it's definitely something to definitely look at, so you can easily be tricked. And so this is what I would bring, an M150, because I know it's going at 30 rounds a minute, so that's basically has 3 times the damage that this guy has, and he costs almost half the price. So definitely look at that. And so now Jeeps, something to note here when you look here, we see this number of strength. It's basically like the HP of a unit. In the case of infantry, the strength number actually tells you how many units are in the squad, and so we'll look at that later. And typically all vehicles have 10 strength, except for Jeeps, which only have 5. And so not only are Jeeps not armored, but they only have half the HP per se. And so for that reason, I mean, Jeeps just die super easily. So that's something to note here. So when you're trying to decide, do I want my M150 that's armored, or at least lightly armored, or do I want a Jeep? But these Jeeps, they do shoot at 30 rounds a minute, so they're shooting pretty fast, and the damage is pretty good in these, and they're very cheap. But they just die so much easier than an M150. Zippos are your flame shooting tanks and vehicles. They kind of work. Problem is, I mean, to use your flamethrower, you have to get in close enough that if they have rocket launchers, they can shoot you. And so it doesn't. Depending on what kind of infantry is in the city, this may not be useful at all. And so I don't use them too much, but I don't know, why wouldn't you want to have flamethrowing tanks? I do like Bradleys here. They have a decent amount of armor. But so here's something. I mean, this Bradley here. I mean, normally I like these Bradleys. They shoot at 26, 25. I mean, these are great rockets. But the rate of fire is only 10. When I can go here and spend less money, and so I'm losing a little bit of armor here, of course, but I'm just doing 3 times the damage, and I'm doing it for quite a bit cheaper. So this is kind of one thing I personally have started switching. Instead of using my Bradleys, I've started switching to just using these cheap M150s, because they just, they put out a lot of damage really quick. And so those are things you need to look at when you're looking at vehicles. Recon, when you're looking at Recon, this optics, and every unit has optics, but optics tells you how well they see other units. And so when you're looking out, it basically will say, depending on how high your optics is, whether it's good, very good, or exceptional, we'll see how far it opens, you can see out into the distance, and also will kind of tell you how far you can look into the trees. And so, I mean, it's definitely kind of important. So this is the biggest stat here when you're looking at Recon. There's just all sorts of different kind of Recon you can get here, but exceptionals are obviously the best, and so there's a big advantage to getting an exceptional Recon. But even just very good is still pretty good. I don't know. Using good is, I mean, if I'm running a bunch of tanks, maybe I can just throw this in with the tanks, because I mean, so you can see how much cheaper this is compared to buying one of these guys. And so I mean, you can definitely use these just as cheap units to kind of throw in without much risk. But you're not going to see nearly as well as if you get like one of these exceptional. You can see here it has the extra, I don't know what that is, some sort of camera sensor or whatever that is there, that makes it exceptional versus just very good. So that's really the most important. And then all these kind of work different. For instance, you can get a Bradley that is a Recon, so you're just going to paying a little bit extra, and I assume there's probably like some sort of extra camera or something that goes on top of here. So now we look at tanks, and so when you're looking at tanks, the biggest thing I look at is accuracy. I mean, just you notice here you have your elite tanks, which has like 11 accuracy, and it does 19 damage. But I drop down just to a non-specifically elite tank, and these are still elite tanks, but they're not prototypes. Or I guess these actually are not prototypes. Anyways, but it's just like the second level of elite tanks, and I drop down to 8 accuracy. And I mean, that's pretty significant. I mean, just accuracy is so big when they're shooting. And so the big things when you're looking at your tanks, you need to look at your accuracy, your damage, and your rate of fire. And so one example of how rate of fire is a big deal here, well, in armor, I mean, this is another thing. You're looking at your armor, and this is telling you here, this is the armor that's in front, this is the armor that's on the sides, this is the armor that's on top. So this is like if they drop an airplane drops a bomb right on top of you. This is the armor that's behind you. So in the case of an Abrams, they're just super armored. They have 17 up front, 9 on each side, 5 in the back, and it makes them very difficult to kill. And probably the most armored in the game is your T-80Us, which you use here, which has 20 up front, 9 on each side, and then 3 and 3. And so you're looking at armor, and then but if you're looking at your damage, a big deal is your rate of fire, accuracy, and the damage that you're looking at, and of course range. And so one unique thing here, so when I look at this, I see this Abrams here, because it has 11 accuracy and 19 power. This is kind of a really DPS powerhouse, and so when I use these, I want to keep them protected because I know they can do so much damage because they're just so much more accurate than, you know, a lot of if I've talked about using meat shield tanks, and so usually this is my meat shield tank, is the Starship, and these guys are only shooting at 6 and 11 versus 11 and 19. And it just makes such a huge difference because not only is it more damage, but the accuracy, you have to factor that in. And so I mean, really, one of these is maybe does maybe even a fourth of the damage that I can expect out of this guy. Maybe, probably not even that. But then another thing comes down to rate of fire. And so here I notice that my cheap Starships are only shooting at 7 rounds a minute. My elite Abrams are shooting at 10 rounds a minute. And then here, when I look at this guy, he's shooting at 15 rounds a minute. And so he doesn't do as much damage. He does 13, but he's got 8 accuracy, which is okay. It's not amazing, but it's okay. And so when I see these guys, they only cost 50, so I can buy 2 of them, let's say, for every one of these elite tanks. I see these as kind of like DPS tanks because they have high rate of fire, decent accuracy, and decent damage. But they actually have very low armor. As you can see, they only have 3 up front and 1 1, so they're actually pretty easy to blow up. And so you can kind of rank your tanks from which ones are more tanky, which ones are more DPS oriented. For me here, your M1A1 Abrams are your more DPS, whereas if I go to M11P, you see I instantly drop down from going from 11 and 19 to 8 and 15, which is a pretty significant drop in damage output. And so these M11Ps for me actually become more like tanks. They're more tanky to me, whereas these M8AGSs are much more DPS for me. And then these Starships are more like meat shield, or they're more tanky for me, even though they do have these kind of cool rockets. So when you're looking at your tanks, though, that's what you're looking as far as your cannons, and then you look and see what missiles they have on them. Pact will always have better missiles than NATO will, but here we have some decent missiles here, and I think they might have slightly better ones. So here, if I pay 70, I can get I get 8 accuracy and 16 at 30 rounds a minute, versus here I can get 6 and 16 at 30 rounds a minute. And so price-wise, I'd say the Starship is actually better. Even though this has a better rocket launcher, I can get a little more than 2 of these for every one of those. And so for me, I'd prefer just get a whole bunch of these guys and use those. Even though these are going to miss all the time. 6 accuracy is really low on the missile scale. But yeah, but that's something to look at. What missiles are on it? Look at your accuracy. So let's see what stats we haven't looked at. We haven't looked at suppression. The way suppression works is whenever you shoot at something, or if you hit it, basically, this is saying how much it goes into panic mode, how quickly it goes into panic mode. And when a unit goes into panic, like we said before, it gets stunned, so it just stops responding. And so I mean, so that's just a big, huge that's a problem right there. If your unit gets stunned, he just sits there and just keeps getting hit, and he'll usually die pretty quickly. But then he goes into panic, and it takes like probably 30 seconds to start coming out of panic, and then he won't go into full calm for another minute probably, I'd say. And when you're in panic mode, your accuracy goes way down, your rate of fire, it's basically like veterancy, but like the exact opposite. And so what we're going to talk about is how to use, today I think we're going to use some rocket launchers. And rocket launchers is really good, some like rocket artillery. It's really good for just the suppression factor. It basically forces a whole group of tanks to go into panic mode, and it stuns them, and so if I have my line of tanks and I'm coming up against another bunch of tanks, but then I stun and panic all of his tanks, they're now super ineffective, and I'll be able to mop up his army pretty easily. And so that's what we're going to work on, is combining tanks with some rocket artillery today. But that's kind of something to understand. So this number suppression is telling you basically how quickly does it make someone panic. That's what that number is saying. But you have to take this in stride with the rate of fire. So okay, let's look at our support. The different kinds of supports. There's quite a few different kinds. Of course, we have our anti-air, right? And so we have radar anti-air, long-range missiles. We have our close-range missiles, and Shapiro is probably your best one here for the NATO side. And obviously the difference between infrared missiles is that they're not radar, which means they can't be targeted by the anti-radar planes that we talked about earlier. The next we look at artillery. There's basically just kind of different kinds of artillery, and I guess we can quickly cover. I mean, NATO, we have these M110s. These are basically, they only shoot, as you look here, your rate of fire 1 round a minute. They only shoot 1 round per burst. Like whenever you make it, you force attack, it'll only shoot 1 round. Whereas if I shoot a paladin, it's going to shoot 4 rounds per burst. And so these are actually extremely accurate. They're just as accurate as Malkas, maybe even a tad bit more. But since they only shoot 1 round, they're effectively less accurate because they can't fill in nearly as many hits. But if you had a whole bunch of these guys, you could be very accurate and get enough. But since they're only shooting 1 versus a paladin that's shooting 4, they're just not really that effective. But those are your artillery, and then so here, next unit we haven't really talked about before is motors. NATO, I think it's definitely a good idea to get motors because your artillery isn't quite as good as the pack side. Motors is just an alternative, and so motors are basically close range artillery, but they shoot much faster and they're very accurate. And I've actually found that this cheapest kind is actually the best kind because it shoots 4 in every burst, whereas these more expensive ones will only shoot 3. Even though they have more range. I mean, I'd say the trade-off is definitely better to get these guys who are just super cheap. But yeah, if I'm looking at these, I'm looking at their rate of fire. This rate of fire can actually be really deceiving. You actually have to get in the game and test how they work. Because this guy, he has, let's see, or I guess it kind of tells you. So here it says 13 rounds per minute versus 9 rounds a minute. And so it kind of gives you a clue, the fact that these shoot more, whereas these don't shoot as much. But motors are definitely effective they're good at shooting, like there's infantry inside of the trees, and if you can see them, you can just shoot them with these guys. They're pretty good at that. But they're not really so good at like trying to blow up an entire city. They're usually pretty, you kind of have to have specific targets for what you're going for with these guys. But that's important to know. Infantry. A big thing to look at your infantry is this strength number, because before strength was just the HP. In this case, strength has to do with how many units or how many men you have, and so here you can actually see them. There's only 2, versus if I get, and so the problem with only having 2 is that if they go in and you go into a city and they end up fighting other infantry units, they don't have any other infantry to fight with, and so these guys will get demolished by any sort of regular infantry unit that has more people than them. So here, if I look at these riflemen, there's 10. And so these guys will easily destroy 2 guys in just like a city battle. And so the best, when you're looking at infantry, you want to see what kind of anti-tank they have. A lot of infantry only have these little 500-meter range rockets, which are pretty much useless. The only time you're going to be able to use these is if tanks just rush into a city and don't know you're there or something. Because that's just very close, and tanks don't ever want to get this close. And so these aren't super useful. So like in the case of NATO, we have, or at least for the US, we have our light riflemen who are going to carry this 1500 range rocket launcher, which is pretty good. The USA does not have very good rocket launchers, like handheld rocket launchers. They only get this about 1600 range, whereas I know like I'm pretty sure the French, they have some that are going to be 2600 range, and so as well as the Soviets have some, and they only get, like we talked about before, they only get one of these guys, but these Concours have 2600 range as well, and so but the USA doesn't have anything with that kind of range. But so that's nothing to look at. If you're looking at infantry, it's really important to see how long range is their anti-tank rocket launcher, because when you put them in a city, this guy can basically just snipe, and this is really huge range. And so basically you put these guys in a city, and then like tanks can't go anywhere near that city without getting shot. So it's really effective to have long range missiles on infantry. So those are two things I look at. Look at the strength number. So here you only have 5 guys in a concourse, so they wouldn't be as effective typically against units that have 10 guys in them, of course. But they have these much longer rocket launchers, which makes them really useful for that. The stealth will basically tell you how well they can hide in a forest, things of that nature. Optics will tell you how well they can see for you, how well they can see away. And that's pretty much what I'd look at. I feel like we've covered most of the basics. I guess logistics here. Obviously, you have command vehicles, and you have armored ones or tanks. You have different kind of cargoes that bring supplies. I've actually tested this and found it. So you're getting this more expensive kind does actually carry more cargo per unit. I'd say it's probably, maybe double the cargo of a regular kind, but it costs quite a bit more. The advantage of these guys is that even though they're more expensive, they are armored slightly, so they're less likely to get blown up. That's you can kind of choose what you like better. And then Chinooks, I don't know exactly how much these guys carry, but it wouldn't surprise me if they carried a lot of supply for each one of them. And forward operating bases just carry a whole bunch of extra supplies for you. But I feel like we've covered most of our ground here. Feel free to leave questions in the comments. Anything that maybe we're missing about all the different kind of weapons, what they all mean. And also, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but heat does not mean. I used to think that heat meant napalm, and so I was confused what was the difference between heat and napalm, but no, they're not the same. Heat is high explosive anti-tank, and so I don't know if I mentioned that before, but that took me a long time to figure out. And but definitely go back in here if you're still confused. Definitely use the tooltips, and they'll remind you what all these different things mean and what you should be looking for. Oh, it's stabilizer we didn't talk about. Stabilizer is really only applies mostly to tanks, and definitely can apply, I guess, to some vehicles. But stabilizer basically tells you how well his accuracy is affected by movement. So if he has a bad stabilizer or no stabilizer at all, if he's moving, he's not going to be able to shoot accurately at all. But if he has a very good one, like these have exceptional stabilizers, that means I can move and it'll be able to shoot effectively, no problem. So that's good to know which of your tanks you can move with and which you can't. This is pretty useful, like if you set them on a road and they're just flying down the road, which is kind of a cool way to quickly get them into an area that you are close distance. But the nice thing about these elite tanks that have these exceptional stabilizers is that they can actually shoot units the whole way through, and they're not really losing much accuracy at all by doing that, but even though they're on the move. And so they kind of have an advantage when they're moving. But I think that's about everything. I don't know if we'll stop here, if we'll go ahead and play a game. We'll stop here and see how long we're getting, and maybe we'll have to do a separate video to play our game. But here we go. I think that's some useful information there. So definitely leave comments if you still have questions about something. It's kind of a lot of information, kind of boring to go through it all, but it's really important to understand those different kinds of that. I think that would have saved me personally like a whole week of just being confused about just wondering about what all the different units were and why do all these different kind of missiles mean and how are they effective and how do I use them. So I hope that helped. But yeah, I think it's a good place to go. You can call me Cobb. I guess we'll end here for now. So until next time.